welcome everybody to our May edition of our 2024 SPSP webinar series. Today's session is on the CPSC involvement in standards development. But before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, Sedgwick Brand Protection. Sedgwick helps to make these webinars possible and helps to make them free for everybody. So thank you, Sedgwick. So let me just sort of tee this off. The CPSC is required by statute to first rely on the voluntary standards development process to address product safety issues before they can consider rulemaking. But if relevant standards don't exist, or existing standards aren't adequate, or if there's widespread non-compliance with relevant standards among manufacturers, then the CPSC may begin the rulemaking process. Now, additionally, CPSC may incorporate some of the voluntary standards by reference into their Code of Federal Regulations, thus making compliance with essentially voluntary standards and makes them mandatory. Now, recently, there have been some cases where the CPSC has rejected certain voluntary standards and have moved to develop their own rules. While this has resulted in some tension between the CPSC and the regulated community that has worked collaboratively to develop voluntary standards, it's important to understand why the agency might take that step. Now, this webinar will explore how standards development organizations such as UL and ASTM International work with the CPSC to help ensure safety of products, of consumer products, and how the CPSC views and contributes to the standards development process. Today, we've got two fabulous speakers and one mediocre moderator for this webinar. Jacqueline Campbell, first, is the Voluntary Standards Coordinator at CPSC. She has the responsibility for leading the agency's voluntary standards program, involving more than 150 standards under many different standards developers. And George Borlays is Vice President of Standards Development at UL Standards and Engagement. He leads the drive to initiate and develop and publish new and updated safety standards and ensures that ULSE standards activities actively include diverse stakeholders. George was also a former employee of the CPSC. And I'm Don Mays. I'm a product safety consultant, but I am also president of the Society of Product Safety Professionals and the chairman of ASTM's F15 Committee on Consumer Products, with oversight of 63 different ASTM subcommittees involved in the development of more than 100 standards. So with that, what we're going to talk about today is first, how the CPSC works with SDOs. If we use the term SDOs, that's Standards Development Organizations. We're going to talk about how ULSE's relationship with the CPSC, ASTM's relationship with the CPSC, and then we're going to do a little bit of myth busting. At the very end, we're going to leave some room for questions and answers. As Gladden said, be sure to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat to submit questions, and we'll do our best to try to answer them. Just so you're aware, we are recording this session, and it will be housed on our archive website on the SPSP website. So with that, let's sort of kick this off and talk about how the CPSC works with a lot of different standards development organizations. And this is a lot of alphabet soup, granted. But today we're going to focus really on just ASTM and UL, but actually the CPSC works with a lot of these different organizations as they help to develop standards. And the level of activity, I think, is going to surprise people on how active they are in the voluntary standards development process. So let's start a little bit with George. I'd like to kick it off, George, because George, UL has been reorganized. It's a whole different organization now. And I'm not sure that everybody really understands all the different divisions of UL. And maybe you can sort of lead us through and tell the audience how UL currently works.
Yeah, thanks, Don. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. First, thank you, SPSP and Don, especially for the opportunity to join you all today. Thank you, Sedgwick, for being the sponsor. Jacqueline, it's always great to be on any panel with you, so appreciate that. And appreciation to all of the attendees that are on the call right now. Y'all made a great choice of what to do with your hour on being on this panel, and appreciate you choosing to spend the hour with us. So, but with respect to UL standards and engagement, which is green in the middle, a lot of familiar perhaps with the UL and the UL circle, and we've been around for over 120 years. And in fact, Underwriters Laboratory started with the term electrification, which may sound familiar, because in 1893, in preparation for the Chicago World's Fair, electrification was big. They were putting electricity in places like houses that hadn't been there before. They were going from petroleum-based combustion engines to electricity, and they were worried about fires. There was a whole discussion about alternating current versus direct current. All of this may sound familiar because here we are in 2023 talking about electrification and how it's batteries instead of internal combustion engines, AC versus DC power, et cetera. But so with that long history, what's happened over time is that we've created 3 organizations now, 2 nonprofits, UL Research Institutes, which is focused on safety discovery, UL Standards and Engagement, where I now work, which is very focused on the standards, and then the engagement with the public and society on safety. And then UL Solutions, which is now a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange and is the testing, inspection, and certification company as part of UL. So 3 distinct organizations, but with a shared mission. And so when you hear UL, for the purposes of today, it's Team Green, UL Standards and Engagement. So next slide, please. Just quickly as we go through, and we're talking today about the voluntary standards development process. It's a similar process across all of that alphabet soup that Don Mays showed earlier. So I'm going to just keep it kind of at the high level. But the key thing is that it all starts with proposals. Somebody brings in ideas for either a new standard or a change in a standard. And then all of this work is done by technical committee members, of which, as we're talking today, CPSC would be one of the members of those technical committees, regardless of which alphabet soup you want. It looked like a random letter generator on that previous slide, I know. But whichever standard development organization's working through it. And there's a proposal review and a vote. We're talking about consensus standards such that there's a vote by these technical committee members, which is a cross-section of people. And in fact, on the next slide, as we talk about what are the people, this one's a little ULSE specific, but it's the same, same music, different words depending on the organization, which is you've got a chair and somebody who's serving that executive secretariat role. And then you have a number of different members that represent different segments. In this example, you can see that we've got consumer, general producer, and the key here would be for the AHJ regulator. That's the interest category that's probably of most interest today, pun intended, with CPSC. For ULSE as part of it, as we're talking through the interaction and the partnership with CPSC and the SDOs, a key point here is that it's a consensus vote. Everybody that's on here gets one vote. There's not somebody who gets an outsized number of votes, and there is a required balance such that any one of these interest categories can't be more than 1/3, so that you don't have any one group that can do block voting and just achieve consensus on anything. So
George, one question. You mentioned AHJ regulator. What is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I love my acronyms. So sorry, it's another TLA 3-letter acronym, and that stands for authority.
George left the government, but he couldn't let go of this.
I know, absolutely not. Authority having jurisdiction. And so that's for purposes of today, that is not just CPSC, and we'll talk about it later. That may be your local inspector for codes, for example. So there's a lot like the state government, et cetera. So it's not just the federal government and not just CPSC.
Right.
So, and on the next slide, I am not going to go through all of these, but what you see here on this list is a pretty wide cross-section of different types of products and systems that we're involved in developing the safety standards for, with our CPSCs participating in our development and maintenance of all of these different safety standards. And the two that I'll just highlight on the left side there, about halfway down, batteries ingestion. That's standard UL 4200A, which was just updated last year and then implemented under Reese's law. So this is trying to prevent infants and children from ingesting button cell batteries. And then on the right side, there's this really great 5-letter acronym, SCIEE, for robots. Think service robots, and that first edition standard just published yesterday. So happy to report that the activity on that has resulted in a first edition standard that we just published yesterday. So, and
So
with
you
that,
mentioned Reese's, you mentioned Reese's law with battery ingestions, and
yeah.
I think that a lot of people are curious as to whether Congress initiates the standards development process because they're asking UL, let's say, to develop a standard to address a safety issue, or is it that UL sort of understands a situation in the marketplace that poses a safety issue, safety hazard to consumers, then begins the standards making process, and then UL or the Congress then sort of accelerates the process. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I can. I'll keep it kind of specific to the battery ingestion issue with Reese's law. So there was an existing consensus voluntary standard that we had, UL 4200A, that specifically addressed the enclosures related to button cell batteries. So with the direction that came from Congress in Reese's law, and for what was proposed by CPSC, we're able to use that to update and improve the standard. But there was an existing standard already there. This was not a case where Congress said you have to do this, and we were, starting from scratch or blank sheet of paper to create the standard. There had been a standard in existence for a while with an existing technical committee, et cetera.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about ASTM. And this is, I'm sure, a little bit of an eye chart, but
Yeah, it is.
CPSC's involvement is huge in ASTM. So
Yeah.
Jacqueline, I think you can talk about this.
Sure. So I think one thing is that you don't have to read all of these details, right? We do, and I want to plug this. We do twice a year publish a report called the V-Star, which outlines all of the voluntary standards activities that are on our operating plan at the CPSC. So I encourage you to check that out if you want more detail on individual efforts that we have. If you go to our website, or really the easiest thing I think to do is to Google CPSC and VSTAR, and that will bring you to the page where you can find it. Before I jump in, I do want to just echo all the thanks that George did a great job of laying out there, and also always happy to share a panel with George because he not only is a great engaging speaker, but also knows all the ins and outs and can always help me out on the details if I really need them, as he was my former boss. Also want to thank you, Don, for providing these slides for context, because I think that this really helps frame the discussion. So really, before jumping in on the ASTM part of this, I did want to just take a moment to make a couple of points about the CPSC, because I know why we likely have a number of stakeholders here who know our agency really, really well. There may be some who haven't interacted with us extensively, or maybe only in just a very narrow instance. So just to kind of frame the agency, we are an independent federal agency. And what that means is that we answer to Congress, not the president. And the agency is led by 5 presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed commissioners, 3 in the same party as the president, and then 2 of the alternate party. So I always try to give people kind of an idea of how much we're responsible for. We have a jurisdiction covering more than 15,000 products. And that's most consumer products, maybe with almost anything you can like walk into a store and buy. With some exceptions, like we don't cover medical devices, on-road vehicles, cosmetics, food, things like that. But I'm sure you can see that that's a whole bunch of stuff that we're responsible for. And with that being said, we are a relatively small agency. We're about 550 staff. That's including the commissioners and their staff. And our budget's just over about 150 million, which I know, like, if you're just thinking about 150 million, that sounds like a lot of money, but it's really not when you consider, again, that jurisdiction that we have and what we're responsible for. So I think just by that framing, you can see why the agency is so reliant on the voluntary consensus standards process. So on to just a little bit about how the agency interacts on the voluntary consensus process. So like most agencies, the CPSC follows policies that are set out by a couple of different government guidance documents, OMB Circular A119 and the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act of 1995, sometimes referred to as NTTAA. And those documents encourage agencies to adopt voluntary standards where it makes sense. And you know, just in lieu of creating regulation, just as long as the SDO meets certain requirements, things like openness and due process and balance. And George referred to a little bit of that balance when he was showing kind of the way that a group could be put together. You know, additionally, and Don mentioned this, under some statutes under which the commission does rulemaking, we can only issue a mandatory standard if the voluntary standard is not likely to adequately reduce or eliminate the hazard, or if it's not likely to be complied with in the marketplace. So there's two things there that we're usually looking at for most of our rulemakings on whether or not we're going to move forward. So CPSC staff participate in voluntary standards, and we're regulators, so I'm going to talk about some rules here. We follow 16 CFR Part 1031, and that's what basically outlines the who, what, when, where, why, how of agency participation in voluntary standards. So this rule was most recently updated in 2016, which included updates that allowed staff to vote and to hold leadership positions. So that's the most recent updates to that. But staff participates in a lot of different ways. And if you've been on a committee with us, you've seen this. We are attending and contributing in meetings, sharing incident data, making recommendations for revision, reviewing and commenting on ballots and proposals. And whenever possible, we're trying to take part in laboratory studies and research as well. So again, as you can see in this slide, there's a lot that of different activities that we participate in this slide and the previous slide. That's just two SDOs. And granted, ASTM and UL are the SDOs we participate with probably the most. But then there's others, and we saw the earlier word soup generation that Don showed. Some of them are very small SDOs. Some of them are not primarily standards developers. They may have some other function, but also have standards for their products. So we have a lot of different SDO stakeholders we interact with. And so, you know, there's a lot of different ways that we have to be ready to interact and educate and those kinds of things in terms of the SDOs. Okay, so that was super high level. So I know if you have questions about how the agency participates or how staff participates, and maybe even a little bit on the interaction of regulation and voluntary standards. Once we finish the webinar, I mean, we're gonna hopefully have some time for questions, but you definitely can feel free to reach out and I can do my best to get answers for you. Thanks.
So one of the things about ASTM, what George mentioned, balance. ASTM also maintains balance in the fact that they don't allow producers and the votes of producers, meaning generally manufacturers, to outweigh other parties. By other parties, we're talking about consumers, because there are a lot of consumers that participate in ASTM activities, as well as users, who could be a municipality that might be using, let's say, a playground standard, and then general interest, which might be people like testing laboratories, for example. And so ASTM makes sure that they keep a balance so that the producer vote when a standard goes to ballot doesn't outweigh those other groups collectively. It keeps a lot of balance in the committees. The one thing that I will say, and George, you'll probably say this too for UL standards, you know, these don't develop at a rocket pace by any means. It takes a long time. I think the fastest standard development since I've been involved in ASTM has been something like 10 months from start to finish, which was an incredible pace. Most take, in some cases, you know, multiple years. In one case, I can think of about a decade to actually develop a standard from start to finish. And a lot of it has to do with sometimes conflicting priorities among stakeholders and trying to get agreement. But at the end, you try to get consensus. And the CPSC is involved in that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how CPSC is viewed when they participate in that voluntary standards process to help sort of move things along. CPSC can initiate standards development. I will get letters, for example, from the CPSC to ask us to take on a new standard. We just got a letter actually this week asking us to look at, of all things, metal bristle grill brushes because the bristles can break off and people can ingest them. And they want us to look into standards development for something like that. So anytime that there's a sort of a hazard identified, we can sort of jump into this whole process and start a standards development activity, trying to find people who chair these activities, and then move the process along as quickly as possible. But it's not quick. So, okay, let's.
Although I will say, compared to regulation.
Okay, that's a fair assessment. So let's talk about some myths and maybe do a little bit of myth busting. So here's one myth. Anytime the CPSC is involved in the development of voluntary standards, it becomes a regulation. So George, do you want to address this one? Is that right?
Yeah, I'll address this myth. So I went back in our lab and I, constructed 3 different prototypes, right? Like to test it in Mythbusters. I'll talk a little bit about why this myth is not true. I think it can be muddled at times because, for example, if you're looking at some of the regulatory work that CPSC is currently involved in, there are voluntary standards that are becoming regulations that are congressionally mandated, especially all of the durable nursery and infant products that are associated with what they call Section 104, the Danny Kaiser law under Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, which was passed in 2008, I believe.
Right.
So there are, I'll say exceptions that prove the rule here. And there is that congressionally mandated grouping related to durable nursery and infant products. But, outside that, I just want to say so when we talk about a consensus voluntary safety standard, why are we creating them anyway? And the reason we're creating them is because there's a risk to society that we're trying to manage. There's a risk from fire, especially the stuff we do at UL, standards and engagement. There's a risk of fire, risk of electrical, mechanical, et cetera, and we're trying to manage that risk. And and we use voluntary consensus safety standards to be able to manage that risk, enable innovation, and provide, industry and others with, some assurance and some trust that if they have a product or system that meets the voluntary standard, that there's some assurance and trust that, the risks and it's safe, if you will, to, whatever the consensus agreement is, the level of safety that's in that standard. And the reason I say the why is because that's why CPSC is involved. They're involved because they see something, that a risk to society, in this case, specifically the US, but that they're trying to manage and using the voluntary standard process to manage it. And so if, with the voluntary standard, you've got the risk managed through the consensus process, that kind of becomes the end of it. And so I just wanted to frame it that way because that's a little bit of the why, one, we write voluntary safety standards, and the why of why CPSC is involved in that with them, and why, oftentimes it stops with the standard. So I would say, Don, busted.
No one told me we're supposed to have props.
So George and Jack, let me just follow up with this a little
Yeah.
bit, because George, you mentioned the 104 rules related to purple nursery products that was part of the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008, where essentially ASTM standards became mandatory. But there's also something called a 15J rule. I'm wondering if maybe you can explain that and how that relates to, it's a CPSC standard, but how does it relate to the voluntary standards?
Yeah, it's a completely different beast. So, referring to a 15J rule is a mechanism by which the commission can identify or define a product as, and all the lawyers are getting ready to write this down and then correct me later. So, I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, and we went to one day of law school, so I need a little grace here. But for the 15J rule, it's the commission finding that a product is a substantial product hazard if it doesn't meet specific readily observable characteristics that are in a voluntary standard. And kind of the opposite of the whole rulemaking approach, in order for the commission with the substantial product hazard finding, they actually find that the voluntary standard is effective and the voluntary standard is widely complied with. So it's kind of like the opposite. And the idea being that if you're going to say, okay, if you don't meet these certain characteristics in the voluntary standard, it's a substantial product hazard, which means automatically stop it at the ports. You can keep it from entering the stream of commerce, especially, or if it's produced domestically, you can, prevent it from being produced and distributed. They want to point to standards that are effective in everybody's meeting. So 15J, bottom line, is a very different beast than like regulations, if you will, but kind of the same intended effect at the end, which is there's a product that doesn't meet minimum safety standards that we can keep from entering the stream of commerce.
So a hairdryer, for example, without the water immersion protection plug on it, they will look at that and they say, no, you can't bring that into this country, or you can't sell this in the marketplace.
Exactly. Yeah, the ground fault circuit interrupter plug on your hairdryer. If everybody after this call, don't leave right now to check, but everybody that has a hairdryer, if you look, they'll all now have that GFCI plug at the end.
It better. Myth 2. Let's talk about the second myth. Once a voluntary standard is incorporated by reference into a federal regulation, it's never updated. Jacqueline, is that true?
Well, depending on your experience with voluntary standards incorporating by reference, it might seem like a reasonable assumption, but also the opposite, I think, is true as well. So when a voluntary standard is incorporated into a regulation, it can be done in several different ways. And there was one. We mentioned 106s, right? So it really just depends on how the rulemaking was undertaken, and specifically what statute is used as the basis. So I think it really depends on what the intention is, right? In some cases, CPSC is directed to do things a certain way, right? And again, we talked about the 104 rules, the durable infant and toddler products, where there is potentially an automatic update unless the commission takes some action. Again, very high level explanation of that one. But I think there's other times where there's an intention in making a reference static. So, for example, we may do a partial incorporation of some testing conditions that are specific to a certain test procedure, right? Where the requirement is based on years, maybe decades of experience. And when those things get changed with some frequency, staff may not be confident that those changes can be supported by historical data. So I have one example of something that I used to work on, which was an incorporation by reference with a group called the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists, where we referenced just some laundering processes. And those standards have been updated over time, but we still are referencing something that's much older than the most recent revision, because we have a lot of experience with those particular conditions. So I think that for that one, it really just, it always can be updated, right? So I'd say that the commission can always initiate a rulemaking to update references. If there's a compelling safety need, certainly, I mean, that's what we're looking at primarily, but we also have to be mindful of resources being available for that effort as well. So, one thing I will note is that in recent years, compared to the decades previous and for the commission, there have been a number of congressionally mandated statutes that have some sort of direction on updating IBR standards. However, it isn't always this automatic update mechanism or prescriptive update mechanism beyond our regular rulemaking. So another example of a recent standard was adult portable bed rails. That's one that we have an incorporation by reference, but it does not have an automatic update mechanism. You would have to go through full, what we call Section 7 or 9 rulemaking in order to do that, which is a much longer process than, say, the 106 process, which is something that can happen with a direct final rule, which is, probably something that could happen in 6 months or so.
I know that when ASTM ASTM has to update their standards, or at least review their standards every 5 years. And there are times when an update has been made to an ASTM standard, it's been submitted to the CPSC for incorporation by reference, and then CPSC has rejected some of the changes because they feel that it didn't enhance safety, right? Isn't that one of the criteria? It has to enhance safety.
It's one of the statutory requirements for the commission accepting the update. It has to be a safety positive change or revision. So if there's anything that is not going to improve safety, then the commission legally is not supposed to accept it.
Okay, let's go to myth 3.
So I think Jacqueline was saying that one was busted.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, I got the props for you, Jacqueline.
So myth 3, standards that are incorporated by reference in a regulation must be purchased from a standards development organization.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Is that right? Well, so
Can I get my credit card ready?
Yes, enter your credit card number in the chat. Make sure to include the 3 on the back, please. And you'll all be part of SPSP by the end of the call. So no, on this myth, Jacqueline mentioned IBR, which is incorporated by reference, which is the term where, in this case, CPSC has incorporated, say, a UL standard into the regulation. And for this myth, there is a lot of discussion right now about incorporated by reference and making sure that there is access for the public to be able to refer back to the standard if it's incorporated by reference. And for UL standards and engagement specifically, I'll speak to us, every standard, whether it's incorporated by reference or not, but the 1,350 standards in our library, every single one of them is available for free viewing on our sales site, shopulstandards.com. You don't need to purchase it in order to view it. So we have an online free viewer application that's available for all of 1,350 of our standards, not just the ones that may be incorporated by reference. So it is a hot topic, though, with respect to making sure that those standards are available and not hidden behind a paywall. And that's something that we've made sure that you can at least read all of our standards. They're still available for purchase, but if you just need to read it for the scope, et cetera, whether it's incorporated by reference or not, you can go to our website. So,
yeah, the same applies to ASTM standards. That ASTM standards are also that are incorporated by reference are also available in a read-only format from
right.
ASTM.
Additionally, ANSI has an IBR page for other SDOs, and the idea here is that the government wants to be sure that there is a reasonable access by the public for things that are the basis for law. So I think and I think it's just fair to note that there is a tremendous amount of legal activity on this surrounding copyright, et cetera, that we won't go into today, but there definitely is that. So if you are one of our stakeholders and you're looking for the underlying standards, you can reach out to us. Especially our small business ombudsman is a great resource for finding these documents in a read-only format.
Myth 4, CPSC only relies on regulations to determine product safety issues. Is that correct?
I think this myth can be reframed as the question, are voluntary standards really voluntary? And the answer is technically yes, but there are definitely a number of ways that the Commission relies on voluntary standards rather than regulation. We've already talked about a couple of those, the 15J rules, and that moniker, it refers to their statutory underpinning, so that's what that comes from. But they're not regulations, so they don't require certification or any of those things. However, they are enforced fairly stringently, as George was talking about. Also, we typically will look to voluntary standards when we're assessing product safety. Looking to these standards kind of as minimum safety requirements that are accepted by the industry. So, for example, we may have a product that's not a regulated product, but that we're seeing some sort of incidents that are occurring in the marketplace. And so we may evaluate those products in our lab to look at their safety using voluntary standards. So staff will typically test these products using these standards for potential enforcement decisions that could be made. So, I think that, again, there's a number of different ways that we use these in lieu of regulation. So I think that it is really important in the marketplace for you to understand not just what regulations you're subject to, but also the voluntary standards that would be applicable to your product. And I know one thing that I usually will talk to stakeholders about is be sure that you're working with your test laboratory to create a fulsome testing protocol, so that you're not just looking at what you're required by law to do, but also the things that you should be doing. I mean, many times this is, I know, kind of dictated by agreements with retailers, but definitely make sure that you're looking at whatever voluntary standards could potentially be applicable to your product.
That's right. And in the safety process, the way that I look at it is your first step is look at regulations. Second step is look at the applicable voluntary standards. There are more steps that I won't get into today, but it is absolutely imperative that you need to understand what the voluntary standards are, because the CPSC is also looking, as well as the retailers that are selling your product. Myth 5, CPSC staff are not allowed to vote or hold leadership roles in voluntary standards.
I'm up again. So I already alluded to this. We do have a rule, 16 CFR part 1031, which you can look up, and it tells you everything about how we participate and why and who can and those kinds of things, right? And up until 2016, we did not have voting or leadership that was in place for staff. That was changed. I think previously, one of the things that we can acknowledge is, as a regulator, we do kind of have a big stick to show up at the meetings, right? Because in theory, at least, we could say, well, we're going to regulate. Now, I mean, I've already kind of let the cat out of the bag with a budget of 150 million and staff of around 550. That's an impossibility, right? So we want to make sure that we're there as stakeholders, equal stakeholders, and we're all working towards safety. And in some cases, when it's helpful for us to be in a voting posture or in a leadership posture to help move a safety standard forward, we have the ability to do that.
Can the commissioners actually vote, or is it only staff?
So commission staff, in addition to kind of agency managerial staff who may have a role in approving something that's going before the commission, are not allowed to participate actively in voluntary standards activities. This is all laid out in 1031. And that's because, you know, you want to make sure that you have folks who are engaged in a basically to solve the technical and safety problems, right? And not from maybe a political stance.
Okay. Thanks. Let's go to Beth 6. Voluntary standards process changes when the CPSC is on the committee.
Yeah, so
both of you.
yeah. No, thanks, Don. I'm very excited to answer this one. So I showed earlier when I started in the intro the voluntary standards process, and I will note that there wasn't a different slide for when the CPSC participates versus when they don't. So it is the same process, and especially for UL standards and engagement, that process follows the requirements and the framework set up by ANSI, which is the American National, Standard Corporation, if you will, that puts together the requirements for the development of standards in the U.S. Standards, if we do them in Canada, comply with SCC, the Standards Council of Canada, which is the ANSI's equivalent in Canada. So the process doesn't change when CPSC is on the committee. If they're voting, it's one vote and one voice amongst all of that. And again, back to balance, because I know the question came up. They're one vote if they're voting, one voice on the committee, and there are constraints on any one of those interest categories, such that the producers, for example, can't be more than 1/3 of the makeup of the votes of any one of the technical committees. And when I talk about consensus, it's not a majority vote. It's actually a 2/3 vote for the UL standards in order to achieve consensus. So if you've got a block that's only 1/3 and it requires 2/3, there's going to be other people that need to vote yes on something in order for it to pass. So, and I will say, as part of this, the process doesn't change, and the outcome doesn't always change. There's also not this thing where if CPSC is on the committee, the changes happen. And I'll highlight table saws as an example, where for years there's been ballots put forward to the technical committee on table saws on the active injury mitigation system. The consensus of the technical committee was not to include those requirements in there, despite CPSC but CPSC was very clear on their position and the data they provided. But the technical committee voted not to include those. So, I think it's kind of a corollary with this is not only does the process stay the same, but there's not necessarily, the process stays the same, and it is the vote of the technical committee at the end that drives the voluntary standard, not the vote of CPSC. So I'll have to go busted.
Jacqueline, you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that it can be perceived as being a little bit different depending on what the specific activity is and what is happening at the agency. I know that, and also what the relationship is that CPSC has with that particular group, right? I think George gave a great example with table saws, where we don't always get our way, that's the consensus process, right? However, we have other activities where, especially if we have an incorporation by reference, where there's maybe a little bit more risk for the group, especially if there's stakeholders who have a specific interest in what that standard looks like, and and don't want to see a situation where you've got a voluntary standard that's different from, say, a regulation. So I know that there's very different ways of looking at this depending on the specific situation that you're in.
Yeah, I think you described the situation very well.
Yeah, the process, I think, just to get to George's point, is not different, but the considerations maybe are sometimes different.
Exactly. And one thing that I'll mention is that in ASTM committee meetings, we are reliant on the CPSC to come in with incident data, because that incident data helps to inform us about the hazard patterns associated with particular products, so that when we go into the standards development process, we can try to address those hazards. And in that case, the CPSC actually has a very critical role in the standards development process. Ms. 7, there's only high market adoption or compliance with safety standards if it is a regulation. George, want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. And appreciate this myth because lets me talk a little bit about impact and the impact of our voluntary consensus safety standard. So I talked a little bit before about developing the standard because you're trying to manage risk. But at the end, if a standard falls on our sales site and nobody uses it, did it make a sound, right? And so market adoption is really an important part as we're talking about this with respect to making sure that producers, industry, retailers, et cetera, are buying, making, selling products that comply with the requirements in the safety standard. And there's a lot of ways that market adoption happens outside the, I think Jacqueline called it the large stick of CPSC. In fact, if you look at the extent of the consumer products that are out in the US marketplace, and then you look at the percentage of those that are regulated products, it's a really small percentage, right? There's a lot of other ways that safe products are sold in the US without a regulation. And a couple of those first start with the producers and the retailers. The retailers for a couple products or number of products will say, we're only buying products that comply with the voluntary standard. That's a really powerful tool to make sure that the only thing being sold is something that meets the voluntary standard. So the retailers and the producers, a lot of the UL SE standards, not pictured on this slide because they're not consumer products, they're industrial products. But all of the fuse boxes, old fuse boxes, but that are in people's homes all meet UL standards and are required to, not because there's a CPSC regulation on it, but the National Electrical Code requires that it be a UL certified to the UL standard. And the local building inspector, when they go in, if you've ever had your electrical system heavy up, as they call it, to 200 amps or greater, they are looking for a new box that has been certified to the UL standard. So you've got National Electrical Code, building codes, the local codes that also will drive market adoption.
Okay. Well, thanks. Now it's time to turn to a Q&A. And being the mediocre moderator, I get to first jab at this. so I'm gonna start with Jacqueline. It doesn't seem like all of the commissioners at the CPSC are totally supportive of at least the ASTM process. There was an issue that came up in the priorities hearing last week, but I think let me point to one in particular, which I was very involved with, which was furniture safety, furniture tip over, where ASTM has spent a long time, far too long, in developing an ASTM standard for furniture stability. And CPSC started their own rulemaking process. And it came to a point where the CPSC had to make a decision as to whether to either adopt the ASTM standard or adopt the standard that was actually developed by the CPSC staff. And it was really for which one would be compliant with something called the Sturdy Act, which was a congressional act that was passed that required certain standards to be in place for furniture stability. Not all the commissioners agreed. And I was wondering if, not to put you on the spot, but I wonder if there's anything that you can comment on this without getting yourself in trouble.
I mean, it puts me on the spot in so much as I'm, I don't want to speak for another person. I mean, I think, as I've mentioned earlier, like there are different roles at the agency, right? And they all have a purpose. And as I mentioned early on, we have 5 commissioners, and they are appointed, right? So they are political appointees and have specific interests and goals. And so, we look to the commission to guide the agency, and and I think that that's something where it's a different role than that of civil service staff. So I think you're, depending on the administration, depending on policy changes, or congressional influence. I mean, we have a lot of different impacts that are going to influence a commissioner's position. So I think that I can't speak for them, but everyone has a position.
Got it. Thanks. And George, let me turn to you on one issue, which is e-bikes.
Yes.
Hot topic, pardon the pun. But yeah, what I've been seeing, even in New York City, they're trying to make sure that there's a standard out there, and regulation that would require that e-bikes meet a standard, preferably, I'm sure, preferably to you, the UL standard for e-bikes and e-bike batteries. And I'm wondering just if you can comment about sort of congressional pressure, and how UL responds to that, and what the future looks like to you as far as regulatory requirements for UL standards for e-bikes.
Yeah, no, thanks. Because e-bikes especially have been a real area of focus for all 3 of the organizations that I mentioned before. UL Research Institute, which actually has a specific battery research institute, UL Standards and Engagement, UL Solutions. And on the battery front, I would say that anything driven by Congress is necessary but not sufficient to address the e-bike issue. I don't think anybody's sitting around waiting for Congress to act. They can, although the House just took up yesterday, or was planning to take up yesterday on a floor vote, the HR, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, specifically related to e-bikes and batteries. But the bottom line with e-bikes is that battery fires are a real issue with them, especially when the batteries are not the OEM batteries. They're being replaced with inexpensive batteries. They're being replaced with homemade batteries, et cetera. And a lot of New York, we were seeing it because of the gig economy. So the e-bike was being used as the mode of transportation for a DoorDash driver for 10 to 12 hours right around the city delivering. Batteries don't last 10 to 12 hours. They're hot swapping batteries. Where do you get extra batteries? Not paying all the money that the manufacturer wants. So buying, literally from the back of a store, an $80 battery pack that somebody made themselves. And so seeing a lot of fires then where they were inside. New York City last year passed a law that required that every e-bike sold in New York City as of March had to be certified to 3 different voluntary standards in order to be sold in New York City. And the New York Fire Department and their chief commissioner, Laura Kavanaugh, have been really on the front of pushing for not just New York City, get the law passed, New York State. And what we're seeing then in other cities are, for example, here in Washington, D.C., there's a program, a rebate program, where if you buy an e-bike, you can get money back. But the e-bike you buy has to meet the voluntary standard. So a lot of cities are incorporating into their rebate programs requirements that the e-bikes meet voluntary standards as a condition for the rebate, which I think is a really helpful way of making sure that safety gets baked in. Like, bans are not the answer. You know, we've been working really hard to make sure bans are not the answer, because the e-bikes aren't going away. They're the future. So
Yep.
I mean, you're trying to ban the tide, is how I would describe it. So hopefully that
Thanks,
helps.
George. Yeah, very good. I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. Somebody asked, here's an easy one, is what does ASTM stand for? Well, it used to stand for American Society of Testing and Materials. They now just identified themselves as ASTM International because they want to be known as more than just an American society. A question in from Robert Hoffman says, how does UL keep the producers from having total control of the technical committee? And what is a producer's incentive to add additional safety requirements to the standard? George, can you address that?
Yeah, so talked a bit about the balance that's required as part of our accreditation. So that that's pretty set. But I think it's a really good question that Robert Hoffman brings up about, like, what's the motivation to do this, right? Because it's not all stick, for the industry members. And in fact, we get a lot of proposals from industry members to update and improve the standard, because they recognize that the standards are helpful in promoting innovation, especially like a lot of the ones on the industrial side of the house. So there's a couple motivations for industry to improve the standard. One, if they've got something in terms of their innovative product they want to have in there, it certainly helps with that. It provides some certainty in the marketplace in terms of, here are the accepted safety requirements for the product, and they know that if they meet those, then they've been able to manage the risk associated with safety. So there are some positive motivators, some carrots, I'll call them. It's not all stick. For the producers and the retailers, there are a lot of carrots for not just participating in the voluntary standards process, but meeting the voluntary standard.
Great. Well, thank you. There are other questions in the Q&A that we're not going to be able to get to, but if you look down at the bottom here, you see a website called productsafetyprofessionals.org, Ask the Expert. You can feel free to send those questions into that website, and we will find answers for you, make sure we get back to you. Also, if you want to connect with any of the speakers directly, here are their email addresses that you can ask questions. If you have any questions about the Society of Product Safety Professionals, you can write to our website at productsafetyprofessionals.org. And as I mentioned, archives for this webinar are going to be posted on our website under the webinar archive portal. But I want to take also just a second to talk about some of the educational programs that SPSP offers, because that's what we're all about. We're all about education and consumer product safety education. First of all, we have a very large program on providing certification for product safety professionals. Our 2024 certification program is going to kick off on August 29th with the Virginia Tech and the Research Center in Arlington, Virginia. That's an in-person session, and then we're going to go to a webinar session, and then we're going to have a closing assessment workshop October 29th through 30th at Virginia Tech's main campus in Blacksburg, Virginia. And so this is a program that's designed for people who are experienced in their field. They are looking to distinguish themselves in the field by earning a certification. For the people that are not as experienced, for people that are generally new to the field, or for people who want to, let's say, refresh their skills in the product safety space, we are offering the Fundamentals of Product Safety program. That is an intensive program, 2.5-day program, September 11th through 13th, hosted by Mattel Fisher-Price in East Aurora, New York, which is near Buffalo, New York. So if you or your staff or anybody that you know could benefit from these programs, you can find out more information about these through our website. They're excellent programs taught by some of the best experts in the field.
I think, Don, both George and I are participating, right?
I think you both are, at least, yeah, that's right. experts in the field. Also, on May 28th, we have an upcoming webinar panel discussion with becoming a certified product safety professional. You're going to hear about some of our recent graduates and what it was like for them to go through this intensive program to become certified and how it's helped to enhance their career going forward. And our next monthly webinar is going to be on June 18th, where we're going to have an EU and UK update on new product safety and product liability regulations. And you'll have your regular stellar moderator, Ken Ross, will be running that program. So I want to thank you all very much for attending today. I hope you got a lot out of it. Please feel free to write to us with any questions that you may have. And I also want to thank Sedgwick Brand Protection for hosting this webinar. Thank you and have a good afternoon.